Welcome to episode 20 of the Cycling Europe podcast. My name is Andrew P. Sykes. Now, when I started writing my first book, Crossing Europe on a Bike Called Reggie, I never imagined that it would one day help encourage a man I'd never met, chuck in his long-term job and start cycling in the direction of Australia and New Zealand. But apparently it did. That man is Ian Finlay, and in a few moments I'll be chatting with Ian about his journey so far. Before we hear from Ian, however, I'd just like to encourage you to look out for the next episode, episode 21 of the Cycling Europe podcast, which will be slightly different, slightly special even. It will be celebrating a pioneer of European cycling, and importantly, it will be published on June 15th, 2020, exactly 100 years to the day since, well, I'll tell you more in episode 21. Back to episode 20 and back to my chat with Ian Finlay. Welcome to the podcast, Ian. Could you start by introducing yourself and just explaining what your background is?
Yeah, hi, my name's Ian Finlay. I've been a cyclist for many years, started as a kid, and got a car, and then neglected the bikes for many years, but got back into biking having done a charity ride in my early 30s and got a friendship group as a result of that cycle ride, and I've been riding with those guys ever since. It went as far as we'd go cycling abroad every year to Spain or wherever it's nice and sunny and hilly, maybe have a few beers as well, but never really competitive cycling. It was just purely the social aspect and the fun and seeing the countryside. I've always been comfortable on the bike and enjoyed the whole experience. I just think it wakens up your senses. I never toured before. I never really had any aspiration to tour, I don't think, because I didn't have a bike. I already had enough mountain bikes and plenty of road bikes, so I couldn't justify another bike, I thought anyway. But just a whole series of circumstances changed around my 50th birthday, and it went from there, really.
So you decided to cycle off around the world. As you just said, you're 50 years old, or you were 50 years old. Did you have to stop working? Did you chuck in your job? How did you finance the whole thing?
I'd been working for a big employer for about 20 years, and frankly, I'd stayed there too long. Although I thoroughly enjoyed the type of work I was doing, I was an improvement engineer, which meant working with groups of people, different groups of people all the time. So I really enjoyed that aspect. But I'd just been there too long, and it was getting a bit samey. I had a house that was selling, and I'd actually worked out through a magazine subscription that I could do van conversions, build camper vans. So I went on a course, found it really enjoyable. So with that, decided I was going to resign from my employer and work for myself. But as the house is selling, I was also reading, I'd been given one of your books, your first book, and I was reading that. I really enjoyed it, so I ended up buying the other two books, and in the space of 3 months, I'd read your 3 books. I was leaving work, and I didn't have a house to pay for. And I thought, well, rather than go from one job to the next, and it's going to be quite stressful starting a business, why don't I treat myself to a little trip around Europe on my bike? I really don't know where the tipping point is, but before you know, I told everybody I was cycling around the world. Not to run away from anything, but just because I thought, you know what, I was 51 by that point. I just thought, yeah, I've earned this. I deserve a bit of a break. I'm gonna have a holiday for 2 years. So you would use some of the money from the house sale to put that towards my holiday. And very early on in that process of planning, I started writing down a bit of a contract to myself, because there's going to be tough days. It's a long time to be away from home by yourself. And I just wrote down the reasons why I was doing it. And I wrote 70 pages. And I liked what I was reading as well. I thought, there's a story here. Why a guy in his, 50, 51, leaving his full-time employment and guarantee of a pension, etc. And I just thought that it's a good story. So I started putting together a book. And I'm now 900 pages into that book, and I'm only halfway around the world. So I've got some editing to do. It's a good synergy. What I find is that we'll come to riding alone, if you like, a bit later on, because I think it is part of the journey. I don't feel alone though. I've got a a community on Facebook and a few on Instagram that are following the journey, and they are as much part of the journey for me as the people I meet on the streets as well. It's really great encouragement for me. So what I'm finding is that I'm riding the bike and then in the evenings writing what I think is fairly rich material because it's fresh and I believe interesting. So yeah, the book is inevitable, and maybe it's more than one book. I don't know, but it's something I didn't know I had in me. I didn't know I was going to cycle tour 2 years ago. I didn't know I was going to write a book, but it really is. For a guy my age, it's really quite liberating. I'll be honest.
We're back in the summer of 2018, I think. You set off in the August, if I'm right, of 2018. Before we start talking about the journey itself, can you tell me about the bike that you bought? Because I think actually it's pretty similar to the one I bought last year.
I think we got it from the same shop as well, David at Cycle Sense, yeah. When I was looking at the bike, I wanted reliability. I know when I go on a cycling holiday for a week on my racing bike, the chain gets dirty after a week, and I get frustrated with that. I have to clean the chain, and so I started looking at the carbon belt drive. I was going to get a Surly from America, and then I looked at trying to get that across. It's going to be expensive. I knew nothing about the touring bikes, but I saw an opportunity to go down to Yorkshire and have a look at a bike with a belt drive made by Koga. And it's not until I got there that I realised the prestige with the bike. I kind of worked out it was okay because of the price, which I'd rather not share. But it also incorporated the roll-off gears, which was it was a must because it was all about trying to keep it low maintenance. And then I could concentrate on enjoying the landscape instead of worrying about the chain making a noise or coming off or what have you. So that kind of drove me down the route of a Koga. And I've got to say the process was fantastic because you get to build online all the particulars, the brakes, the seat, the handlebars, even down to an inscription on the frame as well. So I couldn't justify going around Europe for 3 months having spent the money I was going to spend on the bike plus all the other kits. So it kind of justified the world travel as well. And I thought that I'm going to be away for technically 2 years. As it turns out, it's more than that now. It will be more than that. It was well worth the investment. It really was. I'm pleased with the bike. It just has run so well. It's been incredible.
Yeah, I agree in terms of the price. It is a hefty price, but I think since I last spoke to Dave at Cycle Sense in Tadcaster, after buying the bike last year, I don't think I've told one person, I daren't admit to even myself how much it cost. So they're not cheap, but I still don't regret it. They're worth every single penny. We'll come back to the bike in a few minutes because I think you had a few issues with the belt drive and the roll-off hub, which I'd be interested to hear about. But you set off, obviously, across Europe to begin with. Now, it wasn't one continuous trip, was it? You kind of crossed Europe and then you hopped over to Asia and then back to from Slovenia onwards. Can you just explain your thinking behind that?
Yeah, I would like to think it is one expedition, if you like, or one adventure. Until the virus kicked in, it was going to be a continuous thing. As I say, I'm not out to prove anything to myself. So I rode purposely through Central Europe, and I got as far as Slovenia, and then the campsites were closing, and in the last couple of weeks anyway, I was finding accommodation. It was getting too cold. So the plan was then to fly to Southeast Asia and spend the winter there for 4 months, and arrived in Bangkok, spent a bit of time in the national park around there, met a guy who has become a friend ever since. It's fantastic. Through Cambodia, 7 weeks in Vietnam. I had a bit of a problem with tyres there. I was riding the Schwalbe tyres and I assumed that they were bulletproof and I didn't need to carry a spare. But I'd been running the rear tyre too low, I think, and it tore the wheel off, the tyre off the rim basically. I'd worn the bead. And I was kind of stranded in Vietnam because there was nowhere that would sell a 28-inch tyre. They'd just look at the tyre and shake their heads and they want me to go away. But it took me a while to work out that I could actually get a 700C tyre on there. And I ended up riding 400 kilometres with a 23mm 700C on the front, until eventually I found a mountain bike shop that sold me a 29er, which is the same size. So through Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, and then back down to Malaysia. I got as far as Kuala Lumpur. I ran out of time. I was coming back home. I had a wedding to think about a bit later on. But I came back from Kuala Lumpur to Slovenia, where I'd left off, in Ljubljana, and then rode down through the Balkans to Athens. I had a wedding, so I flew home for the wedding with a friend. And then from there, came back and went through Central Asia, Turkey. I couldn't go through Iran, sadly, so I went through Georgia, Azerbaijan, across the Caspian Sea, which was an incredible adventure. You read so much about this on the blogs, and everything came true. The delays and all the phone calls and the not knowing what's going to happen. That really was a great adventure looking back on that. I was with a group by that point, and I think we were all disappointed that it was all over within 24 hours. We wanted the ship to come across a storm or something and we'd be stuck at sea. And anyway, it was a great adventure. It was a good time. And then from there, through Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, which I have to say has been the highlight so far, just because of the extreme conditions and culturally the things that I've learned about the world. I only got as far as we got through the Pamir Mountains. I'd really like to spend more time talking about those if you don't mind, a bit later. But we got as far as Osh, and then the weather was turning again. So from there, I would head to the Southern Hemisphere, and I've just come back from 5 months in Australia and New Zealand. And the intention was to come from New Zealand and then head back to Osh, and through Kazakhstan, through China, Japan, North Korea, South Korea, before then heading off to America 6 months later. So the idea is to go around the world plotting a route, but doing it when it's nice weather and I can enjoy it, and hopefully that comes across in the writing as well.
So when you do finish, you will have one continuous route all the way around the globe. It's just that obviously you're choosing your little bits to do as you travel, and you're obviously picking out the places where the weather is going to make it a bit easier, for want of a better word. I'm sure it's not easy sometimes. Now, you sent me a list of all the countries you've been through, and you've picked out some highs and some lows, and there's a few bits that I've highlighted because I'm just intrigued as to what they refer to. And the first one is actually right at the beginning in Belgium, and it's a low, and you've referred to the fact that you left your gear with a stranger. What happened there?
Yeah, it was a guy I'd met the day before on the road. So bearing in mind I'd never toured before, I met a guy, I guess in his 30s, he was riding from Finland. And what I've discovered since is that when you meet people, when you're out on the road, you just have an immediate connection. You know, you're there for your own reason, and a bit of freedom, and it's really easy to find friendship with these people. Anyway, we'd got a campsite, and he liked beers, and I like my beers now and again. So I'd said, he agreed that he would get some food on, and I'll go into town and get some beers. So we got directions for where town was, took all the kit off the bike, and just left it on the grass beside his deer, and then rode into town. And it must have taken 20 minutes to get to the town, and then it was uphill coming back. And it occurred to me, I've only met this guy yesterday. I've got all shiny new kit. He was on a budget, and it just played on my mind, and I thought the worst. So I rode like a lunatic. I'd got a bit more fitness in my legs, and I rode like a lunatic up this hill. And I got there, my gear was gone, and I just thought, you idiot, you're so trusting. Why? He'd moved the kit because he didn't like where we were camping, so he moved everything. There he had our tea on, and then we sat and had beers all night. So it was a learning curve for me in learning when to trust and when not to trust. And there's a sense of going into a town and you can feel whether it's safe or not. That happened we had a bit of an incident in Albania where we'd gone into the wrong town, and it felt the wrong town as well. And we ended up being followed by these guys that said they were thieves, and they were waiting to see where we camped, and they would, I guess, take some of our kit. But that's really the worst I've come across. It just, my naivety. I'm still learning now about the security and the trust, but I've been lucky so far. The bike's still intact, and I still have it, so that's a good thing.
I'm trying to think back of all the cyclists that I've met when I've been cycling. I think the least of my worries have been with the other cyclists. I think they tend to be a fairly friendly, reliable, trustworthy bunch of people. I hope I don't have to eat my words at some point in the near future now. But yeah, I can imagine how perhaps you thought when you left your gear with him, thinking, was that a good idea? Now, you had some gear issues in Switzerland with your roll-off hub. I thought roll-off hubs were indestructible.
Yeah, the reason it became more significant was just the circumstances under which it happened. So the plan was I was in the centre of Switzerland, and I'd ridden over the Furka Pass and another pass on that day, and it was an awful lot of climbing, because I'm climbing at 6 kilometres per hour. But it was absolutely stunning. And the idea was I'd go from there through the centre of Switzerland to Austria. But I got to the top of the Furka Pass. I'd done too much that day, and the weather turned, and I ended up having to put all my layers on to then descend into icy cold rain, into a town that looked like it was closed. So I ended up finding somewhere and then booking it on booking.com, and then knocking on the door immediately, because I thought maybe he'll turn me away because I'm wet and dirty. And he took me in and took me to my room and said, "I'll bring your food." So I don't know what was really going on there, but it was below freezing, and it was against my endless summer theme. I got up the next morning, and the weather was awful, and it was cold, and I was riding into a headwind, and I changed into something like 4th gear, and the pedals just turned, and there was nothing there, no traction whatsoever. They just spun. And then I engaged another gear, and it was okay. So it kind of hit at a bad time. So I pulled up and took some shelter behind a building, put some more clothes on, and thought, okay, the best thing I can do is get out of this situation, and I'll ring David at the shop for some advice. So I looked at the weather forecast, and for the next 10 days it was going to be the same. And I was at altitudes about 1,500 metres. And I concluded, okay, I'm not going to go to Austria now, I'm going to go to Italy, and I could be there tonight. So I ended up riding over the Goddard Pass in fog, wind. It had been snowing, incredibly cold. But by the evening I was in Italy, and it was 22 degrees, and I put the tent up, and I was a happy guy, not only because I was in sunshine and I was warm, but the liberation of actually changing the plans so instantly and being in Italy. So I rang David up at the first opportunity I got, and he said, look, it sounds as though it's just cable adjustment, which sure enough it was. It was just a matter of getting the cable tension correct. And the gears were absolutely fine. The gears have been fantastic. I've since replaced the gear cable, and it is quite a tricky job. I generally do all my own bike maintenance. It is a tricky job, but I believe I've got to understand, getting the cable tension right and what have you. But the gear unit itself is phenomenal. I do maintain it. I've changed the oil 4 or 5 times now, and it's a fairly straightforward process. And I would thoroughly recommend a roll-off. I wouldn't consider anything else, to be honest.
Later on, you did mention having issues with the belt drive as well.
Yeah, one bit of feedback, I guess, to Koga is that the gearing was too high, because I'm carrying quite a bit of kit as well. I'm carrying the bike, and my gear is about 56 kilos, and then I started at about 90 kilos as well. So there's a lot of weight there. So particularly in Greece, I had a particularly hilly route through Greece. I concluded that I would change the rear sprocket. Now, the only way of changing the gear ratios was to change the rear sprocket for a larger one, which would then mean also changing the belt, because you've got very little adjustment in the belt length. So I did the sums. I've got a great app that you can download for the belt drive, and it works out how many teeth you need here and there and etc. So I enjoyed that actually. It's quite good fun. So I replaced the belt that gave me effectively pinching the two top gears from the roll off, so 13 and 14, and placing them lower down. The belt I've had, I don't know whether I would go for a chain or whether I would stick with the belt in the future, because going through Central Asia where it's dusty, you get dust on the belt and it squeaks and it seems to be embedded as well. And yes, you can clean the belt with water, but I found going through Central Asia, I was spraying water on it every 5 kilometres. It became annoying really. So I've since replaced the belt for a new one. The problem goes, but it's returned again, and I can only conclude that I'm carrying too much really for a belt drive. So maybe I'd have gone for a direct chain. I'm not sure.
Interesting. I had the squeaking problem quite shortly after I bought the bike last year with the belt drive, and I did find, like you've just said, that if you threw water on it, it did go away. And when I went to Spain and Portugal last summer, that's exactly what I did. When I filled my water bottles up, I would normally just chuck a bit of water on the belt drive. But you can buy, or you can use silicone lubricant and put that on the belt drive, and that's what I do now. And I have to say, it works pretty well. It doesn't obviously clog up. It's such a thin lubricant. It doesn't create anything like the clogging that you get with oil, but it does the trick in terms of it just makes it work as it was when it first came out of the shop.
When I was in Croatia, I actually got snowed in Croatia, so it gave me an opportunity to go and seek out some silicone spray, because it's quite hard to get hold of. And I managed to get quite a large can of this aerosol, and I agree, it actually seems to be easier to pedal as well, so it's obviously helping with the reducing the friction. But I think because I was trying to keep on top of the belt going through, I think it was Uzbekistan, where I was on a dusty road. When you spray water on the belt, I think I've got the slightly older version where the sprocket is just held on with a circlip, and there's nothing but grease really to stop the metal to metal contact. So if I'm spraying water on there regularly, it washes away the grease. So I found that I have to quite frequently grease that up, but I think I've got an older version of the roll-off carbon belt marriage, if you like. So going through Uzbekistan, I kind of got it in my head that the silicone spray was making the dust stick to the belt, and I wanted a reason to throw it away because it was big and heavy. But I wish I'd kept it, to be honest. Yeah. I agree with you.
I bought the silicone spray actually before I went to Spain and Portugal, but I couldn't find it. I really wanted a tiny little can, like you can buy tiny little cans of WD-40. I couldn't find one, so the can I bought was actually a big one, and I didn't take it to Spain and Portugal, and that's why I ended up just throwing water on it. I think, speaking to David shortly after I bought the bike, or exchanging messages with him, I think Gates now do sell an approved lubricant for that belt, and I think it comes in a fairly small can. So I think before the next time I go away, hopefully later this summer, I'll try and get hold of a small can of the official stuff that they use. Just another question regarding your kit and bits and pieces. 54 kilograms, that's a lot of kit.
It was 56.
Whoa.
Yeah.
That doesn't include the bike?
That's including the bike.
Including the bike. So the bike is about 16, I'm guessing, 16, 17 kilograms?
17.9. It's a big frame. I'm quite tall. So it's a big frame, 60 centimetre. And then that's including 3 water bottles. I'm carrying, because I'm filming, I've got a drone, I've got a GoPro, I've got a laptop so I can do some video editing. So I'm carrying quite a bit of electronic stuff as well. The tent that I've got, it's an MSR, so it's like a hubba. It's a 2-man, because I concluded it was my home for a couple of years, that I didn't want a 1-man minimalist setup. I thought there might be days where I'd be stuck in the tent all day when it's raining and really bad weather. So I bought the Hubba Tour, which is a 2-man, but it also has a huge vestibule, and I can get everything in there, including the bike. So there's a bit of weight in that. It's 2.7 kilos. but it does give me the opportunity, if I want to go for a walk into town and feel as though there's a sense of security. So going back to what you say about you meet other people on the road, yeah, they're in the same situation as you. I know now that they're the least likely people that are going to take your belongings. And I think to a degree as well in the campsites, there is that. Yeah, everyone's in the same situation, so it's one of the less likely places that you're going to get things taken. So yeah, I've got a tent that can take all my gear, and it just gives me a bit of freedom to go and explore. Because fundamentally, I'll admit I'm a bucket list tourer, and I'm going to these places to see these places, and so I don't have to go back again. And I want to do them justice. So yeah, I'm carrying quite a bit of kit, and each time I come home, change from one hemisphere to the next, I'm thinking, what can I get rid of? And I'm gonna do that with some earnest before I go away again this time and get rid of some kit. I've got a solar panel as well through Central Asia, for example, where charging my kit was really going to be difficult. The solar panel has worked fantastically. I'm not riding fast enough to really get any power out of the Sun front wheel overcharger. So yeah, I have got a lot of kit, but it's my life. So I just have to put up with it. And so far, I can get up the hills. I don't avoid any hills. I enjoy the climbing. I get a lot of satisfaction out of climbing the big hills. And the knees are still holding up, despite being 53 years old now.
Yeah, I suppose bringing it down from 50, 55, 56, you said, minus the bike, obviously, is a bit more manageable. So that's about 35 overall, I think. I've never weighed my kit before I've set off, but on the odd occasion where I've taken a flight, I've always been a bit surprised how little it weighs, because you've got to weigh it, obviously, when you take it through the customs, and it's always been under 20. So I always kind of imagine that anything above 20 would be excessive, but...
So yeah, when I'm flying locally, I have to pay extra for the bike box. What I'm finding is that the bike is, by the time you get the bike and the bike box together, there's not really a lot of capacity for adding anything else in the box. So I've got the bike in there and the helmet and my empty water bottles. And then when I'm packing my panniers, I take one of the front, one of the rear panniers, and I wrap them in cling film. So it makes one package. So I'm still paying for the bike and 2 bits of hold as well. It works out expensive each time I'm flying back and forth. Some countries are more lenient than others. When I came back from New Zealand this time through Los Angeles, I think the Americans are quite, they'll stick to procedures, and I got hammered for excess weight and baggage there. But hey, I think in the scheme of things, it does add. It sounds a lot of money, but I'm getting a fantastic adventure out of the whole thing. And I'm doing it in nice weather most of the time.
You've travelled through Europe, you've then flown off down to Southeast Asia, and then you've flown back to do the Central Asian section. What month are we now talking? Are we talking early 2019?
So 2019, yeah, so back to Slovenia in March. I rode through the Balkans. It was a bit of a race, but actually it worked out fine. I think I saw enough of the countries that I wanted to see. So we've got Albania, Croatia. The coast of Croatia was absolutely stunning. It really was nice. Really good experiences in Croatia. I did a slight detour into Bosnia to go to Mostar for 2 or 3 days. Montenegro, which is very relaxed and beautiful. North Macedonia, and then into Greece. I was a bit disappointed with Greece because there's some stunning scenery, and then I went to Meteora and Delphi, very beautiful places. But there was big dogs. They were in packs, and there was lots of litter on the side of the road as well, which is something you maybe wouldn't see if you're driving past in the car. But on the bike, you see so much plastic on the side of the road. It was really quite disappointing.
Yeah, I remember that when I was there. There was a lot of great big piles of rubbish. It looked as though it had been tipped there. And I also remember Greece was the first country I cycled through where there were a shocking number of those little temples by the side of the road where somebody had been killed. It was depressing, but it did bring home to you how lethal being a cyclist, or presumably being a motorist as well, was on some of those Greek roads.
It's incredibly graphic. It's very moving. Yeah, I've got to agree. I mean, you do feel a sense of vulnerability, and it's a good reminder to keep on the edge of the road, not take things for granted, because you're a big load as well, and cars have to stop behind you. They might get frustrated at that as well. There is a sense of vulnerability, and it differs by every country as well, depending on the character of the people behind the wheel. So I rode into Milan in Italy, and I was so stressed by the time I got off the bike, because they're quite passionate characters, and any space that I would leave in front of the bike between me and a car in front, there was somebody with zip in front, and I found it really stressful. And then you go to other countries, in Thailand, for example, where they probably haven't got the same tuition, and certainly the driving test is a lot simpler, and yet the people are so incredibly courteous and kind. So I'd find myself in situations I'm going around a roundabout in the wrong direction because I can't process how where I need to be is maybe, and people just stop and wave you past. So it differed in every country, and you could kind of get a sense of the culture of a country before you'd actually spoken to anybody, judging by their driving and by the way their dogs behaved. It's quite a strange thing to observe, really.
No, I think that's an interesting observation, the fact that when you are on a bike, your first encounter is usually with people who are potentially trying to, well, perhaps not trying, but who could potentially kill you by driving into you. So, I've never thought of it like that, but that's an interesting observation, and it does play on your mind. I remember cycling into Albania, and it took a while for me to, meeting the people, and I thought, God, these people are just as nice as everybody else. But there was a certain amount of animosity, probably based upon the fact that I was being hounded on the roads by these fast driving, close passing idiots in their black old Mercedes from the 1980s.
You go to these places, and then it's only afterwards you think, I should really read up on the history of this place. And they've had a pretty tough few years. And there seems to be two groups there. There's a really poor farming community, if you like, and they are beautiful people. They'll wave or flag you down, give you bread. And then there was the drugs that are there, and the guys driving the black Mercedes. And it was a group of those guys that were following us for quite a few kilometres, to be honest. So yeah, I've got mixed feelings about Albania. Beautiful country.
In terms of accommodation, you were presumably using a mixture of camping. You've mentioned in Switzerland going into a hotel or a hostel with Booking.com. You mentioned Couchsurfing. What happened with the Couchsurfing in Turkey?
So I was riding with a couple through Turkey, and we were going to Pamukkale, which is a very popular tourist destination. And we'd got the opportunity to go to a Couchsurfing host. But strangely, he had 1,600 people, guests, which was a bit odd, but we thought nothing of it. And when we arrived, it was apparent there was no beds in the house. It was just carpets on the floor, and that was where we'd be sleeping. There was, I guess, 4 or 5 other people there, but they didn't have any travel plans. They were very inquisitive. Oh, where do you go tomorrow? Oh, are you going? Oh, okay, you're staying. When do you go out? When will you be coming back? What's in that bag? So these guys were basically taking advantage of the host and staying there as long as they could for free. I think we picked the wrong host, basically. So we stayed there that night, and then first thing in the morning, we went up the road and booked into a hotel. It was a very strange setup, but I don't know why he would want to host his house to people that are just taking liberties, really. But yeah, that was an experience. I don't regret having had the experience, but wouldn't walk into it again.
You said there was 16. He had 1,600 guests.
Yeah.
You mean on the website?
It was the guy that was one of the guys that I was riding with that had made all the arrangements and gave me the statistics. But we arrived. There was nobody there to welcome us, so we just ended up making a phone call, and he said, "Oh, just help yourself. I'll be back from work in a couple of hours." And it was a very open house, and it just felt we were talking one night. It was a guy from Japan, as it turns out, and he'd said that to one of us that his plans, I'm staying here for a couple of weeks just to relax and I'll move on. And then he said to another of us in a different conversation that he was going the following day. And I thought, well, you're not going with my bags, my friend. So with that, we left the following day and found a hotel, and everything was fine after that. That's not a reflection on Turkey, though. I've got such fond memories of Turkey. The people are so hospitable, so friendly. We went there through Ramadan, thinking the shops during daylight hours are going to be closed. How are we going to find food? But we were gifted so much food on the side of the road. It's absolutely beautiful. The people were fantastic. I love Turkey. I was there for 7 weeks in total. So the couchsurfing experience was, I could have had it in any country, really.
Did you use warm showers at all?
Yes. So what I've concluded is that I'm spending too much on accommodation. I went through Central Asia. I'd left my camping equipment, cooking equipment at home, because I knew through Central Asia I could get really good accommodation for less than £10 a night. And there was, for the most part, you could get it anywhere as well. And I kind of got into the habit of doing that. So although I've been carrying a tent around an awful lot, a heavy tent, I've been using accommodation more than I should. It's only when I was in New Zealand, in Wellington, many times I've made inquiries, but I wouldn't get a reply in time, or it took too much organising. So, but as it turns out, I stayed with a couple in Wellington. They'd been cycle touring, and it was a lovely night. It's a really good opportunity to meet people, like-minded people. So the couple of times I've now stayed with the warm showers, and I will do it again in the future. But it's just really you want to be giving 48 hours notice, and then I'm spending a lot of the time writing in the evenings, which is what I'm passionate about and thoroughly enjoy. Then I've got to think about planning. Where am I going to? How far do I go tomorrow? And I tend to look a few days ahead, depending on where the next big destination is. In the worst case scenario, I think I made a commitment to go and stay with someone who was following on the blog, and I had to commit. It was getting towards Christmas, just gone, and I committed to being there within 16 days, which meant that I was then writing to a schedule, and I hated it. By the end of that, I became a slave to my own schedule in that sense. What I like to do is look 1 or 2 days ahead, get a general idea, and then the night before I'll spend time considering, okay, where do I get food from along the way tomorrow? And sometimes get caught out because you leave yourself with too big a stretch to do. Sometimes the warm showers takes a lot of thinking about, and I tend not to make enough time to do that.
Yeah, that's the downside, isn't it, of warm showers. I've never particularly used Couchsurfing, but it's a good way of meeting people, local people, and I've met some really nice, friendly, warm, welcoming people through warm showers, but it does mean that you're committed to being in a particular place at a particular time, and you do feel a bit bad if you miss that deadline or if you arrive early or late. And I suppose with a campsite or a hostel or even a hotel, the nice thing is that you can just rock up in wherever it is and book yourself in there and then, and you don't really need that stress of the deadlines and things like that. So you're in Australia now. This is the end of 2019. Where did you arrive in Australia, and what route did you take?
I arrived in Cairns, and I would then go down the east coast. The plan was to go to Melbourne and then across to Tasmania before flying across to New Zealand for 2 months. So I'm arriving as summer is approaching in Australia, and the Sunshine State is called the Sunshine State for a reason. This is Queensland, and it was tough going because the towns are based every 100 kilometres, which I found out later was pretty much based on how far the horses could travel when they used to use horses to travel between towns. So they're all pretty much spaced out 100 kilometres apart, and some of them days were really difficult because of the humidity. They're growing crops all over, and they're being irrigated, and the humidity is incredible. Really hard work. Sometimes the landscape was a bit the same as well. But when you got to the towns, it struck me as like Australia, but more so. The image I had of Australia, but more so, more heavy. So from Cairns down, there's an awful lot of sights to see between Cairns and Brisbane. Beautiful beaches. I went to Whitehaven Beach, which is named after the Whitehaven from where I used to work. That was a beautiful experience. Headed to Brisbane, and there to 3 families that had been following the blog for about a year at the time, and I got to stay with them. And I had an absolutely amazing time there. I was there for 7 or 8 days in total, and it was an amazing experience. I was able to, so in Turkey, where you would be hosted by people off the street, they would offer you a chai, and then they'd offer you some food, and then they would say, you stay here tonight. And they were all really good experiences. I'd read about these things and never believed it would happen to me. But you got to Australia, and I was able to have a conversation about the journey I was on, and I was sharing the journey thinking, wow, this is me. I cycled from home to Australia almost. It was an amazing experience, and the hospitality, the guys there was really, really nice. Really enjoyed that. And then from there, it was the 20th of December. So I wasn't really worried about Christmas Day because I was cycling by myself. So I was actually on a highway on Christmas Day, pretty much empty. It was a miserable day, I'll be honest. Heading towards Sydney. It took me 10 days to get to Sydney, and that was just 10 days of riding between Brisbane and Sydney for the completeness, really. It wasn't enjoyable, it wasn't pleasant, but I needed to be there because I'd arranged to meet somebody. I'd been invited by another couple to spend New Year's there. And again, I had an amazing time in Sydney. I ended up staying there quite a number of days. I only planned to go for a couple of days, but I thoroughly enjoyed Sydney. It was a beautiful city, it was beautiful weather. The hosts were fantastic, they're good friends. Yeah, I had a really good time. And then it became apparent I was actually able to see the news and discover how bad the bushfires were. And it became apparent it would have been completely irresponsible of me to try and cycle from Sydney down to Melbourne. So it took me a couple of days to come to terms with the fact that it was the first time I'd taken public transport to avoid a section of the journey. But what it did do, though, is it afforded me the opportunity. I had some time there spare. I rode the Great Ocean Road, which was absolutely beautiful. It really was worth it, which goes from Melbourne heading towards Adelaide. So I got to ride that instead, and so I don't regret that at all. And then from Melbourne to Tasmania, from north down south to Hobart.
And then finally you arrive in New Zealand earlier this year. Now obviously at this point you must have heard about the coronavirus and what was happening in China. At what point did you begin to think, this might be an issue and I might have to change my plans about continuing around the rest of the world?
Yeah, so I had 2 months penciled in. I had the flights, I had to have the flights out of the country already booked, and that would be the end of March, 1st of April maybe. Yeah, I was aware of the virus, but I wasn't really following the news. It wasn't on the news so much there because they're an isolated land. I went through the South Island. I had a sore throat, which is actually as a result of the bushfires. And I picked that up on the bus between Sydney and Melbourne. That's how bad the bushfires were, the smoke. And I had a sore throat for about 6 weeks and I was coughing. So when I was on the South Island, I went to the doctors there. And I said, I've got a cough. And she looked up at me. It isn't coronavirus, is it? And then I thought, okay, so it's a big thing, this you know, it's going to catch on. But it wasn't until 4 or 5 weeks later that it really began to hit home, and I had to think about rescheduling my flights. The lady who had booked my flights to get me home got in touch to say, you really need to start thinking about coming home early. We can get your flight a week early if you like. And it turned on its head so quickly in New Zealand. And within the space of 3 or 4 days of me leaving New Zealand, they closed the country down. So they reacted. At first, it felt as though they had nothing to react for. And then they reacted incredibly well. In the last few days I was going through New Zealand, the government had instructed that all the handles on the toilets and in the kitchens were sterilised 3 times a day in all the campsites and things like that. So they were really proactive. So I got flights booked a week early flew home on actually the day after my birthday, got into the UK, got a hire car, and I drove up to Cumbria, which is where I live, towards Cumbria, but established that they were going to close. It was 23rd of March, I think it was. They were going to lock down. So I ended up getting a holiday cottage for a really good price for 2 weeks, in the knowledge that I would have to at least self-isolate for 2 weeks, which I did. But I've since discovered that I couldn't come home and visit my mum because she's on the list of people that need to stay away, stay inside for 12 weeks. So I managed to find a friend's house, or I got offered to stay at a friend's house, which is where I am now. I don't know where I go from here though, because I was going to go to America next, down the west coast, and then across America. So that's a good 5 months, and I really want to do that in decent weather, so I might have to postpone that until next summer.
So you're now back in the UK, and like everybody else, you're just kind of biding your time until we can hopefully start venturing out again, even within the local area. Hopefully you'll finish the cycle around the world at some point, and you'll go through Japan, South Korea, China, I think you mentioned, and then North America, and then presumably you'll return to Britain. Will you go back to work? Will you just head off on more cycling adventures, or what's the long-term plan?
Yeah, so the long-term plan, I thought 2 years was extravagant enough for the travel, but what I've discovered is that it would be too quick a journey, and I'm not quite getting around as quick as I wanted. So I've got the freedom to say, well, you know what, it's going to take 3 years to complete. I will run out of money though, that's the thing. So what I plan to do while I'm at home this time, once the restrictions have lifted on the lockdown, is I plan to do a van conversion. So that's taking a Volkswagen van and turning it into a camper van. And that's what I plan to do in future, to earn enough money to do more travelling. Before I left home, before I left my employer, I wrote a business plan on the basis of the training that I'd received. And that business plan, like another sensible thing that you might do, it grew over the 5 years that I wrote about. Now, as I'm travelling, I thought the more I invest into the business, the more I'm tying myself down to the same spot again. I'd have to have a unit, invest money in that. I'd have to turn over so many vans in order to justify the unit, and I wouldn't have time to travel again. Now, I've since found an absolute joy in travelling, and I started saying, well, I'll work for 10 months a year and travel for 2. And there's so many parts of the world that I'd like to see. If I'm working for myself, I could maybe factor that in. I've since worked out that I could probably fund 9 months of travel with 3 months of work, on paper at least. I don't know whether I'd really want to do that and cycle alone. At the moment, I'm leaving it open. I know that I can do an appropriate amount of work and then travel for at least 2 months a year, which is what I hope to do, minimum.
Okay, well, it's been a fascinating chat and a fascinating tale, perhaps even inspirational for anybody in a similar position who's thinking of, well, jacking in their job, and you don't need to necessarily be in your 20s or even your 30s. You can do it later in life, and there are many good examples of people who've done that. So thank you for that, and let's all hope that sometime soon we're all back up on the road and we can head off again on 2 wheels.
I am clearly fitter and faster than I've ever been on the bike. I'm now riding for an hour a day on my road bike at home, and I laugh to myself. My mind hasn't caught up with how well developed the legs are on the bike. It's amazing the speed I can get. Not that I'm competitive at all, but no, I don't think you're ever too old. I've met a number of people in their 70s while I've been cycling as well, and they were cycling from Holland to Singapore. So yeah, I don't think age is a factor. I think it's health. Society ages you, whereas you're on the bike, and I think you become ageless. And yeah, I'm getting carried away now, but it's fascinating and liberating, and I would encourage anybody who's got any plans or dreams of doing so to give it a go, because if it doesn't work, you can come back.
Okay, thank you. That's a perfect place to finish. So thank you, and good luck with your travels.
Thank you, Andrew, for inspiring me with your books. I greatly appreciate it.
Yet another cycling journey that's been put on pause, because of the C word, the coronavirus. The best place to follow Ian is via his Facebook page, which you will find at facebook.com/theworldbybike. If you have an interesting cycling story to tell, please get in touch via social media at Cycling Europe or by emailing podcast@cyclingeurope.org. You can find all the previous podcasts at cyclingeurope.org/podcast. And remember, tune in on June 15th for a rather special episode 21, of the Cycling Europe podcast. So until then, goodbye.